Good morning and welcome to the Inter-American Development Bank. Muy buenos días. Les damos la bienvenida al Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo. Este evento será en inglés. Pueden seleccionar el idioma de su preferencia haciendo clic en el botón de interpretación en la parte inferior de su pantalla. Voy a continuar en inglés. My name is Felipe Muñoz. I'm the Migration Unit Chief at the Inter-American Development Bank. It's our pleasure to welcome you today here in person or also virtually to host such an interesting event for the presentation of two valuable publications on the integration of migrants and forced displaced population in Latin America and the Caribbean. But I'm really personally honored by the alliance that we are building between the organizations present here today. First of all, under the leadership of our two presidents, the IDB and the World Bank are joining efforts in several areas, and I'm pleased to count migration as one of them. And thank you for all the colleagues of the World Bank that are here that work in migration and displaced population. But also UNHCR has been a long-time partner for research, for projects on the ground, and also we have a memorandum of understanding with them. Also, the OECD has been a reference and a close partner in the production of research and migration in the region. And lastly, I want to thank the Joint Data Center on Forced Displacement, the GDC, for leading this joint initiative, and we are looking forward to building a strong and long-term relationship. Thank you, Aisha, and all your team to be here. Then where this is the beginning of a process that we envision as a long-time process, to produce and make some joint reports to compare evidence, but also to work in operations on the ground. And today we are presenting the key findings of two reports on the integration of the migrant and forced displaced population in the region. And I believe this is for great useful, not only for researchers and academics, but also for policymakers, because they provide evidence that is going to be useful for the continuing process of integration. And thank you for all the other people that are here in the room, people from OEA, people from Migration Policy Institute, people from Global Center of Development, and so many other researchers that are interested in these people. The first report is Socio-Economic Integration of Forcibly Displaced Population in Latin America and the Caribbean. It's a spotlight note that was made by the IDB, OECD, and UNHCR that analyze the specific characteristic of the forced displaced population living in some of countries of Latin America, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Mexico, and also Ecuador and Peru. The second report is a report which name is Venezuelans in Colombia, Chile, Ecuador, and Peru. It's leading by the World Bank, but also with the participation of the UNHCR. UNHCR. And just to begin, I want to invite Thomas Liebig. He's online, the Senior Migration Specialist in International Migration Division of the OECD, to present the spotlight note. After that, we are going to hear Carolina Mejia to present the other report. And after that, we have a very interesting panel, not only with some people from the institutions, but with Juan Francisco Espinosa, who was the former Director of Migración Colombia for 3 years and lead the temporal protection status. Then welcome again, and please, Thomas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Felipe, and thanks to you, the IDB, and the colleagues from UNHCR for the excellent cooperation on this report that I have a pleasure of presenting you here today. This joint work by our three institutions on the socio-economic integration of forcibly displaced populations in Latin America and the Caribbean. So this, to give you a little bit of background, one in every 5 forcibly displaced or stateless persons worldwide lives in the Americas. And as you all know, the exodus from Venezuela has resulted in the largest ever displacement crisis in the region, and with almost 8 million Venezuelan refugees and migrants who have left their country over the last 10 years. Also, perhaps a lesser known fact that about 1/3 of all new asylum applications worldwide are made by nationals from the region. And by the end of 2022, Costa Rica and Mexico ranked among the countries globally receiving the highest number of new asylum claims. So we have been basing this work essentially on national household surveys from 22, which have information on nationality or country of origin, but not necessarily migration status. So we basically proxy the displaced population by the nationalities concerned. And it's also important to note another methodological note upfront, perhaps, that some of these indicators may be upwardly biased because the people who are included in these surveys are often those who have some stable residence. So people who are living on the streets are not necessarily included in all of these surveys. So that's important to note, that notwithstanding our estimates is that we cover the vast majority of the forcibly displaced, not only in the countries that are included here, but also also in the whole region, because these are the most important destination countries. This work actually builds on long-standing work that we have been doing in cooperation with other organizations here from the OECD side. We have for a decade now, jointly with the European Union, provided indicators of immigrant integration for all EU and OECD countries. The settling in, it's basically the largest database available on the characteristics and outcomes of immigrants and their children. And actually, last year, building on that work, we have joined forces with the IDB and also with UNDP to do a mapping of characteristics, outcomes, and also integration policies in the LAC region. So on that basis, we joined forces now with UNHCR to do this monitoring, which focuses precisely on the nationalities of forcibly displaced in the region. And what's the value of these international comparisons? Well, first of all, when you have a difference in poverty rates of 5 percentage points, is that a lot or not? You will only know whether you're performing well or really poorly when you have other countries to compare yourselves to. They provide a benchmark for national performance. And secondly, they also help to identify common challenges and to facilitate the exchange of good practices, which we hope this joint work of the three institutions will provide an impetus in the region. And I think the most important finding, basically, that we have in comparing with the wider publications, where we look at all immigrants in Latin America and the Caribbean, we see a lot more. The picture of vulnerability is a lot more clearer here than we have seen it before, and you'll see that more in a second. More generally, the pictures are becoming a lot more clear when you look at the forcibly displaced, because when you look at migrants more broadly, the picture becomes a lot more diversified. But the forcibly displaced population is highly concentrated in urban areas, and particularly in the metropolitan areas. In Chile and Peru, about 3 in 4 of all forcibly displaced live in the capital cities. And that share is a lot smaller in Colombia and Mexico, but still you see in all countries this very significant over-representation in urban areas, and especially in the capital city here. Also important to note that there are some differences by country of birth. For example, in Mexico, there's a very strong concentration of the Venezuelans in the urban areas, while this is not the case for the Guatemalans, who are a lot more dispersed across the country. Education levels, that was an interesting finding, actually, vary quite widely between countries in the region. Generally, we see an overrepresentation in 4 out of 6 countries that we're covering here of immigrants forcibly displaced among the highly educated, particularly strongly in Chile and Peru. And actually, when you look at the situation of the Venezuelans, there seems to be a clear north-south pattern. Basically, as people move further away from Venezuela, so from Colombia to Ecuador, Peru, and Chile, the qualification levels increase, suggesting, as would also be a theoretic proposition, selectivity in the migration process. So basically, those who are more vulnerable tend to stay in the immediate neighborhood, and those who are higher educated tend to move further away. But you also see that, for example, in the case of Costa Rica, the forcibly displaced, obviously here we're talking about a very different populations, mainly from Central America and less from Venezuela here. And you see that that here we have actually a significant underrepresentation of the forcibly displaced among the highly educated, which is also the case in Colombia. When we look at schooling for the children, that's actually one of the things where we are really provide new impetus to the debate. It's an issue that has not been receiving so much policy attention, to look also at the children of these immigrants and the displaced youth more generally, which is important because this population is growing, as many are now in school leaving age who have perhaps been fleeing with their parents. And we see that they have lower school attendance rates and a higher likelihood to drop out of school at an early age. And in Peru and Costa Rica in particular, the differences are quite startling, as you can see here, with, in the case of Costa Rica, a 3 times higher likelihood to be dropping out early out of school compared to the native born, and in Peru more than twice as likely than their native born peers. When we look at employment rates, here we have the good news that the share of population who is in employment is actually higher among the forcibly displaced than among the native born. And that is quite consistently so across all countries. So far, so good. But the less good news here is that we also observe that that these jobs are often not of very high quality, and in particular, informality is pretty high. As you can see here in the case of Colombia, notably, the share of population that has an informal job is more than twice as large as among the native born. We also see a significant overrepresentation in all other countries except Chile, where, remember, once again, there is also this very high qualification level. So the situation is a bit different in Chile. But you can see that the informality is much higher among the forcibly displaced than among the native born, and that is obviously an issue because a lot of countries have tried to make progress on the front of combating informality. So addressing the issue of labor market integration for the forcibly displaced will also help addressing the issue of informality, and I think the two go hand in hand. It's also important to note here that not only they are more likely to be in an informal job, they also earn lower wages, and they're more likely to be overqualified. That means when they have good qualifications, they are less likely to put them into good value, meaning that there's more to be done to make sure that there's adequate skills use of those migrants and those forcibly displaced. That picture of informality then transcends to different life areas, actually, because health insurance affiliation is often linked with employment. And here you see among the population in employment, the forcibly displaced are strongly underrepresented in all countries among those who have health insurance affiliation. And that is obviously then also an issue for their physical well-being. Once again, particularly large gaps here in the case of Colombia, but also in Ecuador and in all other countries. When we now look at the youth again, we observe that with the notable exception of Peru, in all countries, the forcibly displaced youth are more likely to be in the vulnerable need group. That is a group that is not in employment, education, or training in 4 out of 6 countries, where in Chile both populations are largely at par. And you see once again in some countries pretty high shares, more than a third in the case of Colombia, almost 30% in the case of Mexico, Ecuador, and Peru, of forcibly displaced youth being in that vulnerable group of youth which is not in education, training, or employment. When we look at gender gaps, that's also interesting. We have mentioned earlier on that there's employment rate is higher among the forcibly displaced than among the native born. That goes more for men than for women. And in fact, the gender gap in employment is much larger among the forcibly displaced than among the native born, with the exception here again of Chile and less of a gap in Mexico as well, in a country where nevertheless anyway the gender gap in employment rate is extremely high, with 30 percentage points between native born men and women. And then these the living conditions that I mentioned earlier on, so the lower earnings and the likelihood to less likely to be valuing their qualification. Obviously, that has implications as well for other living conditions, and notably here housing conditions, which is also a big concern. And as you can see here, there's startlingly high overcrowding rates, meaning that families are living in spaces which are too small for them. And particularly large here in the case of Peru, where more than 70% of the forcibly displaced live in overcrowded housing conditions. We also have some data collected on food insecurity, which also suggests some higher levels of deprivation for the forcibly displaced compared to the native born. But there's some variation here across countries, and the indicators are, the questions are not always asked in a way that we compare them well. So I'm not showing you here comparative graph for this one. Well, that's it for this. I hope you will agree, a very rich report, and you can access it here on the links. My colleague Maria Huerta del Carmen and the colleagues from IDB and UNHCR, Jeremy and Craig and Hisham, are also here at your disposal to answer any questions. We'll also publish this from the OECD side in parallel, jointly with IDB and UNHCR as a migration data brief, and look forward to your views and comments on this joint work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for all the work that we are doing together. And I want just to highlight three main messages about this kind of reports. The first one is a baseline in Latin America, trying to use and also a methodology that had been proved in OECD countries. And now we have this methodology for Latin American countries, and we are going to update this report every 2 years just to maintain as a comparison what happened in the countries. The second one is we are looking at a set of countries in Latin America. And in that way also we can compare internally in the region what countries have some strengths in some of the sectors of integration, what others maybe need. And we think this is a useful tool for policymakers. Let's move now to the second report, which is the report doing by the World Bank, UNHCR, and Joint Data Center for Displacement. Carolina Mejia is a senior economist in the poverty and equity practice at the World Bank, and currently working in Latin American and the Caribbean region, and who has led this report of Venezuelans in Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. Carolina, welcome.
Thank you, Felipe, and thank you very much to the IDB for hosting us today. Thank you very much to the JDC Center who funded this report, the data collection behind this report, and many of the activities linked to that. Thank you to our UNHCR colleagues who we collaborate very nicely with, and thank you to the OECD as well. So the man in the picture that you see is called David. David is a computer engineering who left Venezuela in 2018 and reached Ecuador. And because of the fact that he didn't have regular documentations, David was unable to find a job related to his profession. So he decided to learn carpentry instead. And he now works in a local shop near Quito. So as you will see, David is the emblematic face of the Venezuelan exodus that happened in the last 10 to 15 years. So close to 25, 1/4 of the 2014 population of Venezuela has left the country now. And the large majority, close to 85% of them, live in other countries of the region. And they intend to stay there. With adequate policy and institutional response, these migration and human mobility flows actually present a development opportunity for refugees, migrants, and their host communities. And precisely the objective of our report, Venezuelans in Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, a development opportunity, is to inform the response in these 4 countries and other countries facing similar situations and help them to materialize these potential benefits of these flows. More specifically, our report provides a detailed socioeconomic profile of Venezuelans in these 4 countries and compares it to that of hosts using data from household surveys. Some of that data corresponds to official household surveys. Some of that data was collected by us. And as you will see, our report complements very nicely with that was presented before, with similar conclusions in certain areas. So Venezuelan migration has surged since 2018. So most Venezuelans started leaving the country in the early 2010, but the flows really intensified in the half second of that decade. And by the end of 2022, by December 2022, close to 5 million Venezuelans were living in Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, and Chile. About 2.5% were living in Colombia, 1.5% in Peru, and close to 500,000 in Ecuador and Chile. Now, if you look at those numbers today, the numbers have increased slightly, and actually Brazil is another important destination in the region as well. So what is the profile of these Venezuelans that are arriving in these countries? So Venezuelans are younger, they're better educated, and they traveled as family units. So Venezuelans in these 4 countries are mainly in prime working age. That is, they are between the ages of 25 to 45 years of age, and thus they can contribute greatly to the local development, both the economic and social development of these host communities. The average age of Venezuelans in these 4 countries is 35 years of age. That's compared to 43 years of age on average for hosts. And that's basically prime working age. More importantly, Venezuelans are more educated than hosts on average. So on average, they have 12 years of schooling, which actually is equivalent to graduating high school in most countries. And that is 2 years more compared to the host populations in all these countries. And a large share of Venezuelans have moved as family units. That's close to 65% in Colombia, close to 57% in Ecuador, and close to 50% in Chile. Similarly, around 20 to 65% of Venezuelans have tertiary educations in these 4 countries. So the share of Venezuelans with tertiary education is greater than the host population in Chile and Ecuador. And remarkably, in Chile, 65% of Venezuelans report having some tertiary education. That number is almost 50% in Ecuador and close to 38% in Peru. However, despite these qualifications, migrants have difficulties leveraging their professional and academic expertise in the labor market in these host countries. And it must be said here, and Thomas also mentioned it before, that in these migration surveys or hard to reach population surveys, irregular migrants are usually underrepresented. So the real truth, the average, the real average is a bit lower than you observed here. So in all the countries except for Colombia, Venezuelans are more likely to be employed than hosts. And in Colombia, the difference is actually very small, 63% versus 64%. In Chile, where we observe the largest gap, close to 25 percentage points, close to 90% of Venezuelans are employed, compared to 64% of hosts. In the case of Ecuador, that number also reaches almost 9 out of 10 Venezuelans, compared to 78% for hosts. And it's also very high in Peru, where 81% of Venezuelans are employed. And while they are more likely to work than hosts, Venezuelans often find themselves in jobs that do not fully utilize their skills and their capacities. They work in jobs beneath their qualifications. It's a phenomenon called downgrading. Overall, they're employed in services and sales positions and elementary occupations at higher rates than the host population. In Ecuador, for example, we find that almost 50% of them work in services and sales occupation. That's almost 30% in the case of Chile. And in Peru, we observe that close to 40% work in elementary occupations such as janitorial and cleaning services, despite the fact that they have very high levels of education. So needless to say, this misuse of resources results in productivity losses for these local economies. And what partly explains this mismatch of resources is that Venezuelans struggle to prove their qualifications in these labor markets. So most Venezuelans with academic titles have not validated their credentials in their new country. And there are three main reasons cited for that: lack of documentation, lack of information, and lack of resources. So in the case of Venezuelans in Ecuador, 45% of those that have academic titles have not validated them because they don't have the necessary documents to do that. That number reaches 41% in Colombia and 23% in Chile. And needless to say again, there is a gain to be materialized from local labor markets, recognizing these migrant skills and expertise, especially in countries like Chile and Ecuador, where the human capital levels of Venezuelans are so high. In terms of social integration, what we observed is that Venezuelans experience discrimination in all of these 4 countries. So discrimination has been a salient issue for 25 to 34% of Venezuelans in these countries. In the case of Colombia, close to 26% report feeling discriminated against. That reaches close to 33% in the case of Chile and Peru, and close to 40% in Ecuador. And discrimination particularly affects women and young migrants amongst the Venezuelan population. So despite the difficulties that Venezuelans have in these 4 countries, the vast majority of them intend to stay in these countries. And that's a very important thing to highlight. More than 3 in 4 Venezuelans express their intention to stay in Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. And in fact, in Colombia, this rate reached 96% of those that responded. It's also very high in Chile, close to 82%. Also very high in Peru, close to 76%. And this, of course, has implication for that policy response that these countries need to implement. So what are the policy recommendations that stem from these results that I've just shown you today? Well, first, that long-term multi-sectorial policies are essential in the policy response of all these countries in these situations. And 4 factors are critical to these countries, for these countries to materialize these benefits of these flows. The first one is that the economic inclusion of Venezuelan migrants is key. The policy response in these countries should facilitate migrants' access to labor markets through regular channels and at the level of their qualifications, recognizing at the same time that there is a potential for negative effects on some segments of the local population in labor markets. The second factor that must be taken into account in this policy response is that migrants should have access to basic services such as education and health. Migrants and their families should be included in national systems for the delivery of essential services, not in parallel systems that might bring more problems down the road. And as we observed, given that most Venezuelans migrated as family units, access to education, health, and early childhood services is crucial. Third, the third factor that must be included in this policy response is the social inclusion of migrants. These policies should incentivize pro-social behaviors towards them to maximize the potential economic benefits of their presence. The response should foster social capital through targeted integration and anti-discrimination programs and the expansion of opportunities for both migrant and host to engage in civic and daily activities, to build that social cohesion and be able to facilitate their economic integration as well. And last but not least, there should be a concerted effort to continue collecting and analyzing data on migrants. The systematic and updated registration of migrants in national system is essential, and the reliable, up-to-date information of their socioeconomic profiles and situation is also needed to inform these policy responses. If you want to look at more details, please take a look at our report, Venezuelans in Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, a development opportunity, linked here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carolina. And I want to highlight 3 main messages. The first one is the long term. As you can see, not only for this report, but for all the reports that we had available, the intention of at least for the Venezuelan migrants in the Andean countries, is to stay for a long term. It changed all the situation and the vision that we have to see. The second is this information is very useful for public officials, but also for the communities, for the general opinion in general terms, for the public opinion in general terms, as it shows that this migration is not a wonder, is not a burden, is more a development opportunity. And third is still there is a discrimination between the public opinion, and we need to work together also in combat the xenophobic sentiments, and we have so many tools within the institutions. But let's move to our panel. I want to invite to the stage to Melissa, Juan Francisco, and Pablo, and we are going to begin like a conversation with them. Melissa Jones is a Senior Development Advisor at UNHCR. That, of course, is a UN agency. She has 20 years experience advancing opportunities for marginalized groups, focusing specifically on refugees and internal displaced people for the last 5 years. And she previously worked, Melissa, at the World Bank, where she held a range of leadership role across research and operation in more than 50 countries. Thank you and welcome, Melissa. Juan Francisco Espinosa is the former director of Migración Colombia between 2020 and 2022, where he implemented temporal protection status for Venezuelan migrants. Previously, Juan Francisco held the position of Vice Minister of Criminal Policy and Justice and Director of the Financial Information and Analysis Unit, among other roles in the national governments. And Paula Costa, welcome, Paula, is the lead economist and global lead for migration at the World Bank, Social Protection and Job Global Unit, and prior to the World Bank, Pablo worked at CAF, the Latin American Development Bank, the Minister of Economy of Argentina, and among many areas of expertise and social protection, labor policy, migration, and skill developments, and also is research fellow at this Institute of Labor Studies. And I think this is a very important panel. And just because we have this information now, we have these reports, but when I have the privilege to work with Juan Francisco in the government of Colombia, we don't have all this information available. We don't have any data. We don't have, you see in the graphs that it's a student migration. There is a lot of people that are coming. And then I'm going to we want just to hear from the perspective of a public official. These two reports, Juan Francisco, provide detailed information about migrants and displaced population. But how did you manage your situation as a director of Migración Colombia? How you make decisions? Because you have some information, but I'm sure not this important information that we have available now. How you manage the situation and information?
Thank you very much, Felipe. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for this great opportunity. I will start by the end. And things were very different in Colombia if we had this kind of studies that you're presenting today. The pathway without studies and information is very different and painful, because we're trying to do it in a proper way, but in some matter blind of the specific situation. So let me start presenting the one point that Carolina showed us a few minutes ago. It's about the impact of the migration in Colombia. Colombia is not a country constructed with strong processes of migration. I think we should, one more. So migration generate some problems in Colombia and concerns of the population. We move from more than 50,000 Venezuelans in Colombia in 2016 to almost 1.8 million in 2021. And we were in the middle of a pandemic situation. So it was a difficult moment for every country, but was a scary situation for our country, because a lot of people in the street asking for food, asking for some house, for support, with a lot of child present there. So first point to start this conversation is just imagine the impact for us as a country, as a government, and to deal with this situation without information. So what were we thinking about the main impacts? We thought that we can put in a cube of the six main impacts for the migration in Colombia. So first, human rights. We were detecting that we had a vulnerable population exposed to criminal, basically to smugglers. I have some particular interest in disabilities, so we were detecting a lot of child and young people with disabilities that were detected on a visual basis. Was really easy to see it. And we were looking people with hungry and a lot of needs. Second, the health sector was impacted because one of the main reasons of people moving to Colombia was to demand some treatment from health system. For instance, cancer, HIV, diabetes, lots of people demanding and pressuring our system with a high cost. Why? Because the health system of Colombia works under an insurance systems where if the people is out of the system, the cost is too expensive. Actually, some hospitals made the Venezuelan rate that was upper to any cost for a Colombian, was too expensive. Third, in education, the schools were being asked for more spaces to study, but we don't have some kind of a space. And in Colombia, the alimentation process for vulnerable people, kids under 18, works in the education system. So we're about kids asking to eat something in the schools. So it was a double pressure there. On the work environment, Carolina also speak about that, and it was a downgrading of the professionals because Colombians were being impacted by Venezuelans with better skills and with a payment under the legal fee of Colombia. Why? Because they were irregular migrants. In addition, we have an interesting pressure on housing because Colombia was not able to provide house for everybody, and a business started working and was called pagadiario. That's a daily payment to sleep for families. That means if a person or a family cannot pay for this night, they will be outside in the street because it's a daily payment with, I mean, horrible places to sleep in inappropriate conditions, basically for kids, and lots of risk for those families. And finally, we had the securitization discussion about migration. That means some people saying we had a criminal problem because of Venezuelans without any study, just saying at all time that kind of information, including some government officials. So we had a lot of impacts. We know and we were feeling that kind of impacts, but we don't have any study to support. The best information that we had was one made by our host by Felipe, and was about the PEP ramp, was some information about 400,000 Venezuelans in 2018 that lead us and gave us some information to advance, but was 2018. So we were in a blind situation trying to solve all that cube. I think at this moment, with one example of this lack of information was, we think that in the whole migration presence of Venezuelans, we had 12% of young and child, 12%. Today, the data shows 31%. There's an enormous lack of information. So if we, in my personal case, if I know that was 31%, the advance and approach to young and child were very different. Because I tried to. The first documents were for child, but only 50,000. That's not that's anything to 31% of total population of Venezuelan in Colombia. That's one of key points to show you how blind we were in that moment.
No, thank you for this. This is complex, but of course the government of Colombia took so many decisions. One of them is the temporal protection status for 10 years. Do you have any brief comment about what is the pathway you follow it? What is the challenges? What is the discussion between the government to take this such a big decision?
I'm gonna try to do it. Colombians speak a lot, so I'm sorry. In a few seconds, first, communication is a key matter because we were scared. But as Latinos, we cannot admit scare because we're Latinos. We're supposed to be, no? So starting a strategy of communications was really important, but trying to hit some stakeholders, Colombians, saying what's happening here, migrants saying, hey, help us and let us know how we can do it. We will follow the rules, but show us the rules. Third, government partners, because this was not a problem of the migration authority. This was a whole situation where the different sectors were impacted by migration. And finally, and very important, local and regional governments because they receive the hard impact of the migration. So it cannot be a decision of national government, should be focalized at all times. Finally, I think this is a great friend and supported a lot. I really appreciate the full support of Filippo. And finally, this is a teamwork. We must understand that Colombia could not do it alone, and the guy of Migración could not do it alone. The situation of Venezuela is not because of Colombia. So it is okay to raise a hand and say, hey, we need support. We cannot do it alone. Technology, it's absolutely required, basically, to find information. We had at the end more than 60 million registries of information, and we need to process that information. And finally, communication. Speaking at all time, trying to connect and contact everybody. I finally want to show you a short video to reveal this. Sorry, that was made by the Migration Authority team. All my respect to those persons. A great team with great results at that video. Thank you very much, Felipe.
No, thank you, Juan Francisco, for your inspiring, sharing your experience, looking what happened before, what happened now, but I think it was a very good message. Melissa, I'm gonna turn to you. Of course, despite the relatively favorable policies that are across Latin America, the generals of the government, of course, there is still some gaps where we need to work further in the integration. How's your vision from UNHCR? What are the other policies or programs that we can put in work to ensure full economic social integration?
Perfect. Thank you, Felipe, and thanks to the IDB for hosting this. I want to congratulate the teams for the great work that they've presented here. It's not only these important reports that add to the evidence base to support these excellent policies, but it also represents a whole library of work that these colleagues have done. So from UNHCR's perspective, we're thrilled to be part of this effort. And we are particularly thrilled to see the contributions of the development banks and the OECD and other partners contributing to this collective effort. I also want to acknowledge and thank the leadership and the courage of Juan Francisco, of Felipe when he was in the government, and of the other policymakers who have advanced and continued these open and inclusive policies. Your work has literally improved the lives of millions of people. Not only the people of your country, but you've saved the lives of people who had to flee terrible circumstances. And so I want to thank and recognize that and show my appreciation for you. To your question, Felipe, about what more needs to be done, there's a lot. And so happy to go into that. I think about it in two ways of policy prerequisites for this type of social and economic integration, and then the people prerequisites. So I'll touch upon both of those. On the policy prerequisites, we touched upon the legal stay arrangements. So the long-term residency permits that are allowed in Colombia, from UNHCR's perspective, a well-functioning asylum system as well that helps provide permanent protection for people. People need identification to be able to show that they're there legally. People need the work permit. And ideally, as Carolina went into, and Thomas as well, their skills need to be recognized so that they're able to contribute to their new economies at the level of their preparation and their expertise. But not only do these policies need to exist on paper, but they need to be implemented in a way that it's easy to comply with. So if you have to travel 6 times into the capital city to get your residency permit, to get your work permit, to renew things, people are going to fall through the cracks. So you can have very good policies that are difficult to comply with. And this is a region that's famous for its trámites. Red tape, bureaucracy affects everyone, but it particularly affects vulnerable groups. And the refugees and migrants are part of those vulnerable groups. So as part of moving forward, what more can be done? Simplifying procedures, decentralizing administration, removing, if possible, fees. These can all help capture more people into the formal system, which is where the economies will start to see the positive, the benefits from the presence. On the people side, and I'm so thrilled that Carolina started with a person, because these groups and all of the populations we're discussing today are individuals as well. Individuals who have left terrifying circumstances, who have experienced trauma along the way. And when they arrive, they need to feel safe. They need to feel that when they go off to work, their child has a place to go where they can be safe and they can learn, and in the future contribute to the economies as the parents are now. They need a place to live. Healthcare has come up as well. And so these are all sectors in which the development banks have been extraordinary in contributing to the government's ability to expand services, to expand availability of housing, transportation for all of these new arrivals, but more needs to be done on that. And then I'll wrap up with 2 areas. I was very happy that one has been touched upon repeatedly here, both in the video and in Thomas's presentation and in Carolina's as well. Childcare, early child development, youth support to allow the children of these people who are arriving to contribute to the future of the countries in which they now live, as well as their parents have done, or even better. And then labor relocation schemes, because many people arrive into places that even with the best support, with the best policies and investments, they can't absorb the number of people that are arriving. And so Brazil, I know Pablo knows this very well, Brazil has a program supported by the government to relocate voluntarily people from the border areas to the southeastern part of the country, and where there are more jobs, more abilities to integrate faster. Mexico also has a similar program supported by UNHCR. I would love to see it supported more by the government. Chile is a great example of a country that could integrate these types of schemes, but they help to reduce that gap, narrow that gap between the time people arrive and the time people are integrated in and contributing. And that helps release the stress for the individuals that are arriving, but it also helps the country that's receiving so many people receive their benefits as well in a faster, more easy transition. Let me pass it back to you.
No, thank you, Melissa. And I want to highlight something which is important, is for a government, it's important to think that they have support, not only for the development banks, for the institutions that are here, but also for agencies like UNHCR that has offices in many of the places of the countries. Then as long as we work together, we can show to the government that we are here to helping them. I'm going to pass to Pablo. Pablo, you have a broad experience in labor market, but also in other parts of the world. What do you think what additional elements should be included in the policy response in terms? in labor markets to take full advantage of this economic potential that you see, or what other data or information do you think it could be useful to include in this kind of reports?
Thank you very much, colleagues, for inviting me, and of course, congratulations to all the presenters. Congratulations, of course, also to the government of Colombia for this type of interventions, and I want to start with that. I feel that in Latin America, we have governments that have really embraced not only the situation of our brothers and sisters from Venezuela, but also thinking long-term that the best alternative possible is to integrate them as much as possible and not marginalize them, to take advantage of the talent as well. They can contribute to the economies. And I think the reports that we are seeing is going into that direction. And you have this long-term thinking about these people are gonna stay for a while. So let's be sure that we can really integrate them. And again, this is something that is consistent with some of the discourses we are having today, including with organizations like UNHCR, how we can move from simple or short-term humanitarian assistance into self-reliance, especially of some of this population. And this is something that we embrace a lot as well at the bank, and we want to support countries, and we are going to continue doing that in the future. So the two aspects, of course, you were mentioning as well, Felipe, we cannot leave the countries alone, certainly. Hosting refugees and migrations is a global public good. And the moment we continue investing in evidence and also supporting the financing of programs is going to be key for these countries to be felt that they are not being left alone in this situation. So in terms of data, I really congratulate the efforts that we are all doing to collectively all these institutions and making sure not only that governments are more sensitized on the potential of using information to demystify some of the negative perception that some of people in potential some groups in the society may have, but at the same time making sure we connect all those who are in this situation. Basically, how we can make sure that we can make use of administrative records sometimes are not being used strategically to answer some of the questions we have. How we can invest, of course, in collecting new surveys. And I want to congratulate, of course, the effort that the JDC, the Joint Data Center, is doing in that regard, and as well the effort that UNHCR also collects from the ground. On financing policies, I mean, you were asking what are the aspects that we need to highlight. And again, I want to highlight three cases where we see that are different regions that are trying to embrace the integration of refugees with different perspectives, but all of them share some commonality. One is, of course, the aspects of Venezuelans in the majority of Latin American countries. I would also like to highlight the case of Syrians, for instance, in the case of Turkey. And also at the same time now, we are seeing a lot of this in Ukrainians in the European Union. The three countries are embracing three main precepts. Basically, how we can make sure that allow internal mobility of this population, because we don't want, of course, this population to affect certain parts of the countries that may not have the capabilities to cope. So facilitating internal mobility, also making sure they can participate in the labor market, and that's the second aspect, extending work permits and assessing skills and assessing and making sure they can be a full participant of this. And I'm talking about assuming labor market, but also, of course, other services as well, like health and education, as we have been discussing. And third, of course, is basically how we can make sure that all the population is integrated fully into the societies. And that's the aspects that we want to highlight. The case of in Latin America is paramount on that, and we saw that from the presentations. But I wanted to briefly spend also some time on the case of Brazil that you mentioned, not only because I work a lot and I know the story here of what is the situation of Venezuelans migrating to Brazil, but at the same time I feel it's a great example of collaboration across agencies, because we work together here, World Bank, UNHCR, IOM, and as well the government of Brazil on this. This is basically the crossing of Venezuelans in Brazil is happening in the northern tip of the country, especially through the state of Roraima, which is one of the smallest, probably the smallest in population, and one of the poorest as well in Brazil, and home of just 500,000 people. And it has been estimated that around also 500,000 Venezuelans have crossed the borders. Many of them staying in Roraima, which you saw an increase in 20% of the population. And basically what we wanted to look into using data is not only the impact at the local level as well of basically there has been a lot of discussions whether the state of Roraima could cope with this situation, but at the same time, assessing the full integration of Venezuelans into the local labor market, education, and health, and at the same time assess the policies, in particular, the one that you just described on Operación Acogida or Operation Welcome. And the reports are highlighting some of the findings are echoing what Carolina presented. No? On first of all, despite Brazil having one of the most open policies in terms of work permits instead of universal access to education and health, still you have barriers, you have red tape, you have the effective access is a problem. In case of education, you have also language barriers. In the case of work, of course, many are able to work, but in the formal sector, in low pay, in activities that are not taking advantage of the skills, so they are in a way occupied or over skilled for the occupations that they are ended up using it. It's interesting as well the case of the situation in Roraima. Initially, the discussion was this state is not going to cope. This is basically generating a lot of negative impacts on the economy. When we did the analysis, we saw that overall, for instance, when you talk about finances, these Venezuelans were contributing a lot to the local economy. The state were also receiving transfer from national government, so they were not left alone. And at the same time, of course, we had to acknowledge that there are groups that have been affected, and this is similar to the situation that Carolina described on the low-skilled population, on the women that are facing more competition for jobs. But I understand that basically the aspects we need to think about in those cases is to how we can compensate and in a way address those concerns from that group. And the Operation Welcome is basically another example that Brazil and other countries in the region have been fostering, is basically relocating this population to the areas where there is more opportunities for work. Of course, there is more to do. There is protocols that need to be adapted in the services. When you talk about employment services, it's not the same, of course, to address the situations of vulnerable population than the rest of the population. There are aspects of accesses to skilling opportunities that need to be discussed and see how this can be strengthened, but we think that we're going in the right direction on that front. So I want to congratulate, of course, all the Latin American governments that are trying to, one way or another, to see the Venezuelan migration as a big opportunities. And to conclude, basically what we think at our institution is precisely that we need to establish alliances, continue supporting in a predictable way, of course, as much as possible, donor financing and donor assistance to the countries that are hosting this population, but at the same time, with a view that has a much more long term, with the view of fostering self-reliance, with the view of including population into national systems. So not so much on humanitarian only. We need to support the long-term vision, and we need partnerships. No, we need convening power among all of us. We need also the opportunity to create platforms like JDC and others where we can work together, we can collaborate, and we feel count on us, of course, on the World Bank and the other multilateral institution. We also have a platform, of course, of coordinating actions among the multilateral agencies that we feel that basically we need to expand even more so that we don't leave alone governments that have the best intention and have the opportunity to do more for this population. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pablo. We are sadly short of time, but just the final question, just for 1 minute answer, please. But just, this is not first of all, to recognize, as Pablo said, that is not just Colombia was a case here presented, but there is many other incredible advances in Chile, in Ecuador, in Peru, in República Dominicana with the Venezuelan migration, in Panama, in Costa Rica, in Belize. I mean, there are so many things. There are so many things that are happening in migration in Latin America. But just a quick question. What do you think is Melissa, the useful of the regional agreements about that, the platform, these kind of things? And for you as well, the same thing. Is this a decision from a government in one country? But it happens in so many countries. What a real brief thought about what is this kind of challenge between countries? And maybe for Pablo, more than this data, what other tools we have of the banks to help the governments?
Great, thank you. On the regional perspective, we're celebrating the 40th anniversary of the Cartagena Declaration this year, an incredibly important original declaration that set the standard for very inclusive asylum and protection policies 40 years ago. But even more importantly, the governments, the signatory governments get together every 10 years to take stock on the implementation of those goals and to set an action plan for the coming 10 years. So Chile is leading the process this year to gather the states to identify the next frontiers of protection and opportunities for people who have been forced to flee their homes, and then to gain a consensus across the region on what more can be done to help support their integration, their voluntary return if they want to, and protect them from the need to flee in the first place. So a very important year coming up, lots of opportunities for supporting governments in this conversation. And I think as we look at what's happening in the rest of the world, Latin America can continue to be a model for other regions on a responsible and collective response to what are cross-border challenges. So thank you.
Thank you. I was thinking when President Duque decided to announce the DPS, I just remember some countries of the region saying you cannot start that kind of process alone. At this moment, I think those countries were right at this moment, because it's difficult at the end. If we wait for everybody, it may, if possible, that will not happen in any time. But this kind of process are too big and should be discussed between countries. So I think that if we can open spaces for discussion between countries and try to find common places or common projects will be greater than we do. Thank you.
Thank you. No, you mentioned about other opportunities we have, of course, partnering in data, partnering in the platform that we have for NDBs. And I feel overall is to bring in agendas that we can push together on opportunities as well for this population. One that we are working a lot with other UN agencies and other partners as well is on global skills partnership. The global skills partnership are for those who are not familiar, the opportunity to fill labor shortages that are experiencing countries today with in undertaking rapid demographic transition, aging, that they are feeling, they're facing shortages in many key sectors, and how we can link up with the opportunity that we have with the migrant and the refugee population to fill and some of these vacancies and have the opportunity to work. And some involves, of course, bringing population to third countries in the case of not necessarily the host country employing those refugees, but also helping the movement to countries where they can have much more opportunities. We are partnering also with organizations. I want to mention, some of you probably are familiar, like Talent Beyond Boundaries. We have been doing this, and we are evaluating a policy that they have with Syrian refugees being placed in the European labor market. And I think that discussion can also come to Latin America. Again, this is an example of opportunities we may have, supporting governments in key areas and priorities, and coming together as a one single unified voice in this agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Pablo. Yes, yeah, you mentioned that the platform that we have with the other multilateral development grants. I want just to close to reiterate for all the people that were virtual, where you sent a lot of questions. We try to address some of them here, but others maybe we have to have a follow-up of these questions because there are a lot of questions. But just to reiterate that the most important message here is that we are here as an international institutions working together to create more data, more analysis, but the people that are doing the work, that is the governments of the region. We are here to support them, to helping them in the thing. And then let me thanks again to UNHCR, Melissa, to GDC, the Joint Data Center. Thank you, Aisha, for your leadership in this process. And of course, OECD and the World Bank, Pablo, and of course the IDB and all the other agencies and think tanks that are here today, because we work with so many of them. And thank you very much and have a good day.
We're gonna do gender violence.
Yeah, you were great. Excellent. Excellent.